Will there be a global agreement to address climate change in Paris this year? I'm confident the answer is yes. There are still some difficult remaining issues, and I'm sure Christiana will discuss those. But 155 countries have already submitted pledges to constrain or reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. These commitments vary in type and ambition, but together they represent 86% of global emissions and 88% of global population. Procedures like reporting will be binding. Targets or commitments will not be, they'll be voluntary. But, and I think this is quite important, the agreement and the targets will be reviewed every few years with the explicit purpose of seeing where countries stand with respect to their pledges and establishing what the next steps will be. So the obvious next question is, will the agreement be a good one that points us toward the goal that all countries have agreed upon, limiting temperature to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels? The answer is really twofold. I would say that the agreement is good in that most countries, developed and developing, are making commitments, and that's a first. And it's really taken since the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that's 23 years ago, to reach this point. But the agreement is not so good because it puts us on a path that is closer to a 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise by 2100 rather than a 2 degree increase. And that assumes all countries actually meet the targets they have set, which is certainly not a given. So let's look at these pledges for just a moment. I mean, the most ambitious is the EU. They pledged to keep their emissions at 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Then there's a group of countries that in my day in negotiating, we called the juice cans countries. I don't know if we still do, but Japan, the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, who have targets roughly 25 to 28% below 2005 levels by either 2025 or 2030. China agreed to peak emissions by 2030, but before you get too excited by this, it means that China's emissions will continue to increase for the next 15 years. And India has a carbon intensity target of 33 to 35% below 2005 levels. That's emissions per unit of GDP. So India's emissions will continue to grow in absolute terms as well for the next 15 years. Let's just take a deeper dive into the US target. It's based on existing legislation with a large portion of the decrease based on the just issued clean power regulations. It assumes the rules survive, and I think that's a fair bet, even though they're already being litigated. Each state has its own target developed by EPA and must decide how to meet the target. EPA has to approve the plan, and if not satisfactory, can require compliance with a federal plan to meet the target emission level that's provided to the state. Compliance with the approved plans begins in 2022. It's similar to the international regime in that each country, or in this case, each state, has to figure out how to meet their target. And this brings me to the other significant shortcoming that I see in the international regime that is also relevant for the US program. First, we need to keep in mind that when you add up the Paris commitments, greenhouse gas emissions would still be increasing in 2030. What this really means is that actions taken over the next 10 to 15 years must not only reduce as much as possible in the short term, but must also sow the seeds for steep cuts post-2030. When countries submitted their commitments, they provided some discussion on how those commitments would be met. The focus of much of the discussion in the submissions was on energy efficiency and renewables. And clearly, both have to be a part of any program for any country, and for that matter, for the United States as a whole, and for every state in the United States. Certainly, energy efficiency is a no-brainer. It saves energy and the pollution associated with that energy, and it saves money. It's a terrific short-term approach to reducing emissions. Renewables, meanwhile, have come down sharply in price and are growing at a very rapid rate, although off a very small base. Still, increased deployment of renewables is key for all countries and all states, both in the short term and the long term. For renewables, additional progress in storage and transmission technologies is also necessary. But as I indicated, global emissions will clearly not be where they need to be in 10 to 15 years. And while we will not be able to limit temperature increases to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, we also don't have to end up with a 3-degree or a 4-degree increase. So while moving as quickly as possible is important, having a plan that deals with the mid and longer term is also critical. A sound longer-term plan, in my view, must include efficiency improvements and increased use of wind and solar power. But it also has to include 3 additional important components. First, as we begin to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, we need to make sure that we have reliable baseload power, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, everywhere in the world. At the moment, coal, gas, and nuclear supply most of our baseload power. But coal is the leading source of greenhouse gases worldwide, and while natural gas is cleaner than coal, it's still a fossil fuel, and its combustion still produces greenhouse gases. The bottom line is that nuclear is currently the only 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week source of power that does not result in the emission of greenhouse gases. It's hard for me to believe that we can limit temperature increases and their associated impacts without vastly expanded use of nuclear power. At the moment, fossil fuels dominate as a source of electricity, representing approximately 68% globally. Nuclear currently accounts for around 11 or 12%, hydro for around 15%, with solar, wind, and geothermal accounting for much of the remaining 5 or 6%. Under a business-as-usual scenario, nuclear power could decrease to less than 10% by 2035. On the other hand, the International Energy Agency says that nuclear would have to grow to at least 18% if we're going to come close to meeting our global targets by 2050. So increased use of nuclear power should be a key consideration in both the development and implementation of global commitments and the development and implementation of state clean power plans. Second, some form of carbon capture and storage or reuse will also be essential. Even if coal use declines in the developed world, as is now the trend, coal-fired power plants continue to be built in the developing world. Yes, many are more efficient than the majority in use today, but these plants can be operated for 50 years or more. In the developed world, these plants are often replaced by natural gas plants, which are also greenhouse gas sources. To the extent that they can be replaced by nuclear, wind, or solar, the climate benefits would, of course, be far greater. But because coal use continues to grow in the developing world, and natural gas use is growing in the United States and elsewhere, emissions are going to continue their upward trend even under the Paris Agreement commitments. As a result, carbon capture and storage or reuse should also be a part of the plans and programs of those countries and states that are and will remain dependent on fossil fuel combustion. Third, both more efficient and alternative fuel vehicles are critical because transportation accounts for almost 30% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Electric-powered and hydrogen fuel cell cars are possible replacements, but they make sense from a climate point of view only if the electricity or hydrogen comes from a clean energy source, wind, solar, nuclear. Still, there are serious infrastructure issues associated with fuel cell and electric car deployment that would need to be overcome over the next decade for our transportation emissions to be decreased to the levels that would be required. Again, these are key considerations in the planning for a clean energy future for the mid and long term. So where does this leave us? Looking globally, I would suggest that an agreement in Paris is one step along a path to limiting the most serious impacts of climate change, just as the Clean Power Plan is one step for the United States. But one step is clearly not sufficient. Every country and every state needs to not only meet their 15-year emission targets, but must also put in place programs to assure that we can meet our longer-term goals. A clean energy future is not technically impossible to achieve, but it will disrupt business as usual. We need to anticipate and plan for that future, even as we work to achieve our more immediate goals. Thank you.
Eileen? Oh. Take a question or two? Are there any questions from the audience?
How could that be?
No, that's a photographer. He's just standing. We have some up here. Or Julie, you actually have one right behind you. There you go. We'll just do that. We'll be proficiency and then we'll go here.
My name is Malin Monch. I represent Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. And one thing that I've been curious about in this effort to control and limit greenhouse gases is this concept of baseload power. Germany seems to have engineered its system so that the concept of baseload power is now irrelevant. They do dispatch priority for their renewable sources of energy, and they have, through software engineering and through engineering of their hardware, they now use both their coal plants and even their nuclear plants as the fill-in. And China, as I understand it, has also decided to go down this path of giving dispatch priority to renewables. I'd like to know what your comments are on that.
I mean, it's a big step forward, what Germany is doing and what China may do. But I think you have to look at what is possible over this time period. And I think it is very hard to imagine that we will deal with all of the storage and transmission issues, which there still are. I mean, I think Germany at its peak is like 50% renewable and 50% what I would call baseload power. So even if everybody was there, you still have this other chunk of power need, and it's global. There also are people in parts of the world who don't have any power at all. So I think we're going to need baseload power for some significant period of time, even with a good dispatch system, as you point out.
My name is Vijay. Oh, sorry. My name is Vijay Nilekani. I'm a consultant. Just to clarify a question as well, the Germans define burning wood as renewable.
Yes.
And they're importing hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wood chips from the US and Canada. And it's a big carbon footprint, and it's less efficient than coal. So it doesn't make sense. Secondly, they rely on nuclear power from France because it's an interconnected grid.
And coal power also.
Right. So
yes.
I think it's a little overstating to say
Yes.
they resolve all the technical problems. I don't believe that's true at all.
Well, I mean, they are doing a lot in the renewables area. I think the dispatch system is good despite the wood burning. But there is still this need for baseload power. And
Absolutely.
in shutting down nuclear,
Absolutely.
Germany is actually burning more coal.
And they haven't yet shut it all down. So it
No,
would be the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
So where are we, and you can answer we as you prefer, but so where are we on the recognition curve of a role that nuclear energy should play?
Well, let's see. In the U.S., we are unfortunately shutting down some of our existing nuclear, or there are plans to shut it down. There also is some new nuclear under construction, so I think that might sort of balance it out a little bit. I think some of the developments in the new modular systems could become very attractive on a global basis. There certainly are countries that are moving on nuclear globally. I mean, China is actually one of them. I mean, they're doing a lot in renewables, but they're also planning a whole lot of nuclear. South Korea is planning a whole lot of nuclear. So I think it varies as to where it is. I just think it needs to be more explicit. I mean, it's like people don't want to say it, even though some of it is actually happening. And, you know, I think it is part of the solution here. It's not the whole thing, but it's part of it.
And one last question right here.
Seth Bornstein, AP. In terms of, you didn't touch too much on renewables. How crucial is energy storage, battery technology improvements?
Very.
And how far away do you think we are for those?
I mean, there are some interesting new developments in battery storage, which could open things up quite a bit. But figuring it out in the lab and trying it out in small scale and getting it deployed globally doesn't happen overnight. So, I mean, I can conceive of something in like 2050 where we're a lot of renewables, because in fact these things will have come to pass, but we're still going to need some other 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week power. And if you're interested in the climate, you've got to think that nuclear is a better choice than coal or gas.
We got, sorry, we're out of time. If you guys want to grab her afterward, Eileen will be here. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Eileen Claussen.